On the night of August 17th, 1856, at Magnolia Grove Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, a 38-year-old enslaved woman named Patience orchestrated one of the most unusual massacres in American slavery history. 8 people died in indescribable agony, including the plantation master, his wife, the brutal overseer, 2 drivers, and 3 visiting guests who were attending a celebration dinner, what should have been a party to celebrate the purchase of 20 more slaves, became a nightmare of stings, screams, and death. But this extraordinary revenge did not begin with bees. It began 6 months before, when Patience watched her 12-year-old son being sold to a Louisiana slave trader right before her eyes, after the boy accidentally broke a Chinese porcelain vase. The Mississippi Delta, in 1856, was the beating heart of King Cotton. Wilkinson County, situated along the Mississippi River between Natchez and Woodville, was home to some of the wealthiest and most brutal plantation owners in the entire South. Magnolia Grove Plantation sprawled across 2,300 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 147 enslaved souls. Master Cornelius Whitfield had inherited the property from his father in 1842 and had spent 14 years building it into one of the most profitable operations in the region. Cotton prices were at an all-time high, 17 cents per pound in New Orleans, and Whitfield's ambitions knew no bounds. The plantation's social structure was rigid and merciless. At the top sat Cornelius Whitfield, 52 years old, with his pale blue eyes, graying beard, and the permanent scowl of a man who believed the world owed him everything. He had been educated at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, traveled to England twice, and considered himself a gentleman planter and intellectual. He owned a library of 300 books, subscribed to agricultural journals, and wrote frequent letters to other planters about scientific farming methods. But beneath this veneer of civilization lay a man of profound cruelty who viewed enslaved people as nothing more than valuable livestock to be managed, bred, and disposed of according to profit calculations. His wife, Constance Whitfield, was 44 years old, the daughter of a Charleston merchant family. She was thin and severe, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of displeasure. She ran the household with an iron fist, personally overseeing every domestic detail and taking particular pleasure in punishing house slaves for the smallest infractions. She had never borne children, a source of deep shame that she redirected as rage toward enslaved mothers and their children. The overseer, Marcus Sutton, was a hired man from Georgia, 39 years old, with a face scarred from smallpox and hands that never seemed far from the coiled whip at his belt. He had worked on 5 different plantations before coming to Magnolia Grove, dismissed from 2 of them for being too violent even by the standards of the time. Whitfield had hired him precisely because of his reputation for breaking rebellious slaves. Sutton carried a whip with 9 leather tails, each embedded with small metal barbs that tore flesh with every strike. He took pride in his work. Below Sutton were 2 drivers, enslaved men promoted to positions of authority over other slaves. Their names were Jupiter and Caesar, both in their 40s, both despised by the field hands for their willingness to inflict punishment on their own people in exchange for slightly better treatment. Jupiter was particularly hated because he had once beaten his own brother nearly to death for stealing a handful of cornmeal. This was the world Patience inhabited, and what Master Whitfield did not know was that Patience was no ordinary slave. She had been born a Beni in 1818 in what is now Nigeria, daughter of a minor Yoruba queen. When she was 7 years old, British slavers had raided her village, killing her father and capturing her mother and herself. They had been separated at the coastal barracoons. A Beni was sold to an American trader and survived the Middle Passage in the hold of a ship called the Prosperity, packed so tightly she could not move for 6 weeks, breathing air thick with death and disease. She arrived in New Orleans in 1825, small and terrified and alone. A Mississippi cotton planter named Richard Pemberton bought her at auction for $230. She worked on his plantation for 8 years, during which time she was repeatedly raped by Pemberton's son, bearing 2 children by him, both sold away before they could walk. When Pemberton died in 1833, his entire estate was sold to pay debts. A Beni, by then called Patience, a name given to her by a previous mistress who found it amusing, was purchased by Cornelius Whitfield for $450 at age 15. Over the next 23 years, Patience had 3 more children. 2 died in infancy from diseases that white doctors would not treat. The third was a son she named Samuel in secret, though Master Whitfield insisted he be called Sam. Samuel was the light of her existence, a bright boy with his mother's intelligent eyes and a smile that could pierce through the darkness of their bondage. Patience had been assigned to work in the plantation's extensive gardens and orchards from the beginning. She showed an unusual aptitude for working with plants, and when Whitfield decided to establish beehives to produce honey and beeswax for candles, Patience volunteered to manage them. Whitfield agreed, seeing it as a way to generate additional profit at minimal cost. What Whitfield could not have known was that Patience's mother, before their capture, had been the keeper of the sacred bees in their village, a position of great honor and spiritual power. From age 4 until their capture, Patience's mother had taught her daughter the ancient knowledge of beekeeping as practiced by their people for thousands of years. These were not just practical skills, but sacred knowledge passed down through generations of women. How to calm bees with specific songs, how to communicate with the swarm through subtle movements, how to manipulate their behavior through understanding their complex social structure, and most importantly, how bees had been used in warfare to defend villages from raiders. Patience had kept this knowledge hidden for 31 years, using it only to tend the hives and produce excellent honey that brought praise from Master Whitfield. She had 5 hives by 1856, each housing between 40,000 and 60,000 African honeybees, a more aggressive subspecies than European bees, known for defending their colonies with extreme ferocity. Her life at Magnolia Grove was one of constant labor and careful invisibility. She woke at 4:30 every morning when the plantation bell rang across the quarters. She lived in cabin number 17, a 12 by 12-foot structure she shared with Samuel and 2 other enslaved women, Rose and Dinah. The cabin had a dirt floor, a single window with no glass, and gaps in the walls wide enough to see through. In winter, wind cut through like knives. In summer, the heat was suffocating. After the morning bell, she had 15 minutes to eat a breakfast of cornmeal mush and collect her tools before heading to the gardens. She worked until noon, tending vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees, then had 30 minutes to eat a lunch of more cornmeal and sometimes a small piece of salt pork. Afternoons were spent in the orchards or with the beehives, harvesting honey, maintaining the hives, ensuring the queens were healthy and the colonies productive. At 7 in the evening, the bell rang again, signaling the end of fieldwork for those in the cotton fields, though Patience's duties often extended later, especially during harvest seasons. Despite the brutality of this existence, Patience had found small moments of grace. On Sunday afternoons, the enslaved community was allowed 4 hours of relative freedom. They gathered in the quarters, and old Moses, a preacher who had been enslaved for 63 years, led them in spirituals and prayers at the brush arbor they had built in secret in the woods. The songs they sang carried double meanings. Wade in the water was instructions for escaping via rivers to confuse bloodhounds. Follow the drinking gourd, encoded directions using the North Star. Swing low, sweet chariot spoke of the Underground Railroad's promise of freedom. Patience had a beautiful voice, rich and deep, and when she sang, "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel?" the entire congregation felt the power of it. Samuel would sit beside her, learning the songs, learning the hidden meanings, growing into a thoughtful young man, despite the chains that bound them all. She'd been teaching Samuel everything she knew, not just about plants and bees, but about their true heritage. In whispers after dark, she told him stories of their homeland, of his grandmother the queen, of warriors and wisdom, and a time when they had been free. She taught him the handful of Yoruba words she still remembered. She told him that no matter what the white master said, he was descended from royalty, and that knowledge could never be taken away. Samuel was quick and careful, an unusual combination that served him well. He worked as a house servant, polishing silver, serving meals, standing silent and invisible, while white people discussed their lives as if enslaved people had no ears or minds. Master Whitfield sometimes remarked that Sam was an unusually intelligent Negro, which made Patience both proud and terrified, because she knew that intelligence in a slave made white people nervous. But Patience had something else, something she kept even more secret than her royal heritage. The old women in the quarters recognized it and whispered about it with a mixture of respect and fear. Patience was a conjure woman. She knew hoodoo, the African spiritual practices that had survived the Middle Passage. Transformed and adapted, but still powerful. She knew which roots could heal and which could kill. She knew how to make mojo bags for protection and gree-gree for luck. She knew the power of graveyard dirt and crossroads dust and red brick powder. The elderly woman named Aunt Chloe, who had been born in Africa and had been enslaved for 70 years, had recognized Patience's gift when she first arrived. In secret, in whispers, in the depths of night, Aunt Chloe had taught Patience what she knew, adding to the knowledge Patience had brought from her own mother. When Aunt Chloe died in 1851, she had whispered to Patience with her last breath, "The spirits chose you, child. When the time come, you'll know what to do." Patience carried that responsibility with her every day. She wore a small red flannel bag around her neck, hidden beneath her dress, filled with protective herbs and roots. She was careful never to let the white people see it, knowing they would view it as dangerous superstition and punish her for it. Master Whitfield believed himself to be a relatively enlightened slave owner. He provided better food than many planters, a pound of salt pork and a peck of cornmeal per week for each adult slave, plus access to vegetable gardens. He allowed Sunday afternoons off. He did not permit enslaved people to be beaten to death, as he considered it poor economics to destroy valuable property. But his rules were absolute, and punishment for breaking them was swift and savage. The list of infractions that warranted whipping was long: being late to work, working too slowly, breaking tools, speaking disrespectfully, learning to read, trying to escape, stealing food even when starving, and countless other violations of his authority. Whippings took place at the post in the center of the workyard, where all slaves were forced to watch. The guilty person would be stripped to the waist, their hands tied above their head to an iron ring, and then the overseer would administer the prescribed number of lashes, sometimes 25, sometimes 50, sometimes 100. Patience had witnessed dozens of these whippings over 23 years. She had seen Moses receive 75 lashes for praying too loudly. She had seen a young woman named Lily whipped 50 times for burning biscuits. She had seen a man named Abraham receive 100 lashes and have salt rubbed into his wounds for attempting to run away. She had learned to watch with an expressionless face, to show no emotion, because any reaction could be interpreted as defiance and result in her own punishment. Mistress Constance had her own methods of cruelty, more intimate and perhaps more psychologically damaging. She delighted in separating mothers from children, often giving enslaved children to her visiting relatives as gifts. She burned house slaves with hot irons for minor mistakes, a wrinkled tablecloth, a spot on a glass, a meal served 1 minute late. She once forced a woman named Betsy to eat an entire bowl of hot peppers because the soup had been underseasoned, then denied her water for 2 days. When Betsy's throat swelled closed and she nearly died, Constance complained about the inconvenience of training a new cook. But both Cornelius and Constance reserved their deepest contempt for what they called uppity behavior, any sign that an enslaved person viewed themselves as human rather than property. Cornelius would fly into rages when slaves looked directly at him, interpreting direct eye contact as disrespect. Constance became viciously cruel toward any enslaved woman she perceived as too pretty or too proud, finding excuses to have their hair shorn off or their faces marked. Patience had survived this world through a combination of skill, invisibility, and careful subservience. She kept her eyes down. She spoke in the soft, deferential tone that white people expected. She was always prompt, always compliant, always useful, and she endured because she had Samuel and because she believed that somehow, someday, they might find a way to freedom. She had heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, coded messages passed between plantations by traveling slaves and sympathetic free blacks. She knew that some people had made it north to free states, though the journey was perilous, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even reaching free soil did not guarantee safety. She had dreamed of taking Samuel and running, but she knew the risks. Bloodhounds bred specifically to track human scent, professional slave catchers who earned bounties for every captured runaway, patrols of armed white men who rode the roads at night, and the brutal punishments for those caught attempting escape. So she had waited and worked and taught her son to survive and tended her bees and kept her knowledge secret. She had endured 31 years of slavery, clinging to the small joys she could find. Samuel's laugh, the taste of honey from her hives, the spirituals on Sunday afternoons, the stories of her mother and her homeland told in whispers after dark. On the morning of February 14th, 1856, everything changed. The day began as any other. Patience woke at 4:30, ate her cornmeal, collected her tools, and headed to the gardens. Samuel had already left for the big house, where his duties began an hour earlier. The February morning was cold, with frost on the ground and their breath visible in the air. Mississippi winters were brief but bitter. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Patience heard shouting from the direction of the big house. This was not unusual. Master Whitfield shouted frequently, and Mistress Constance's shrill voice could carry across the entire plantation. But there was something different in the tone this time, an edge of fury that made Patience's stomach clench with instinctive dread. She continued working because stopping would draw attention, but she listened. Within minutes, she heard the bell being rung rapidly, the signal for all slaves to assemble in the workyard immediately. This happened rarely, usually to announce new rules or to witness a public punishment. Patience set down her tools and joined the stream of enslaved people converging on the yard, her heart pounding. 147 souls gathered in the cold morning air. The field hands came in from the cotton fields, still holding their hoes and cotton sacks. The house slaves emerged from the big house, their finer clothing, hand-me-downs from the Whitfields, marking their slightly higher status. The children came from the quarters, clutching at their mothers' skirts. Everyone knew something bad was about to happen. Master Whitfield stood on the porch of the big house, his face purple with rage. Beside him stood Mistress Constance, looking coldly satisfied. Overseer Sutton leaned against the whipping post, his 9-tailed whip already in his hand. And there, in the center of the yard, stood Samuel, 12 years old, trembling, a dark bruise already forming on his left cheek. Patience's blood turned to ice. She wanted to run to him, but she forced herself to remain still, to show no reaction, because any display of emotion would only make things worse. Master Whitfield's voice rang out across the silent assembly. "This boy," he said, pointing at Samuel with a shaking hand. "This ungrateful, clumsy wretch has destroyed property of great value. A porcelain vase brought from China by my grandfather, worth more than this boy's worthless hide, has been shattered because of his carelessness." The vase, Patience would later learn, had been sitting on a high shelf in the library. Samuel had been dusting beneath it when his elbow accidentally knocked a book, which fell and struck the shelf, which caused the vase to fall. It was an accident, completely unintentional, the kind of mishap that could happen to anyone. But enslaved people were not permitted accidents. "I will not tolerate such destruction of my property," Whitfield continued. "This boy is clearly too stupid and clumsy to work in my house. He needs to learn the value of hard labor in the fields. But first, he needs to learn what happens when you destroy what belongs to me." Patience's heart was racing so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. A whipping. Samuel was going to be whipped. He was only 12. He was small for his age. She had seen grown men nearly die from severe whippings, but what Master Whitfield said next was infinitely worse. "Sutton, give him 25 lashes," Whitfield ordered. "Then, since this boy is clearly untrainable for housework, and I have no use for field hands who can't even manage simple tasks, I'm selling him. Jeremiah Blackwood will be here this afternoon to take him to Louisiana. Good riddance to bad property." The words hit Patience like a physical blow. Selling him. Taking Samuel away. To Louisiana, hundreds of miles south, where she would never see him again, where he would likely die young in the brutal conditions of the sugar plantations that worked enslaved people literally to death. She heard a sound escape her throat, a small animal noise of pure anguish, before she could stop herself. Several heads turned toward her, Master Whitfield's eyes fixed on her location in the crowd. "Who made that noise?" he demanded. Silence. No one moved. Patience felt as if her body had turned to stone. "I said, who made that noise?" Whitfield's voice rose. "If no one confesses, I'll have Sutton whip every last one of you until someone does." It was old Moses who spoke, his voice calm and steady despite the danger. "Master, I believe it was Patience, sir. The boy Sam is her son." Patience wanted to thank him and curse him simultaneously. He had saved the others from collective punishment, but now Whitfield's full attention was on her. "Patience," Whitfield said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Step forward." She did. Moving through the crowd on legs that felt like water, she reached the center of the yard, standing next to Samuel, carefully not looking at him because she knew if she saw his face, she would break completely. "You dare to question my decision?" Whitfield said softly. The quiet tone was more frightening than shouting would have been. "No, Master," Patience whispered, eyes fixed on the ground. I'm sorry, Master, it was just a sound. You didn't mean to object to me selling my own property." Whitfield's voice rose again. "You forget your place, woman. You forget that you don't own this boy. I do. He is mine to do with as I please. His life is mine. His future is mine. You have no rights here, none. Do you understand?" "Yes, Master," Patience said, the words like poison on her tongue. "Good. Then you'll stand right there and watch while I teach your boy what happens to clumsy, worthless slaves." He nodded to Sutton. "Proceed." 2 field hands were ordered to tie Samuel to the whipping post. His shirt was removed, exposing his thin back, ribs visible under his skin. He was shaking uncontrollably now, tears running down his face, but he didn't make a sound. Patience had taught him that showing pain only encouraged the tormentors to inflict more. The first strike of the whip tore a stripe across Samuel's back. His body jerked, but he bit down on a rag someone had mercifully placed in his mouth. The second strike crossed the first, drawing blood. The third, fourth, fifth, each crack of the whip echoed across the silent yard. Patience forced herself to watch. forced herself not to look away, forced herself to memorize every detail of Master Whitfield's face, the satisfaction in Mistress Constance's eyes, the mechanical precision of Sutton's arm as he drew back and struck again and again. By the 10th lash, Samuel's back was a mass of torn flesh. By the 15th, he had gone limp, hanging from his bound wrists. By the 25th, he was unconscious. They cut him down and threw a bucket of salt water on his back to clean the wounds. Samuel came to with a scream that Patience would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. They dragged him to the quarters and left him lying face down on the dirt floor of cabin 17. Patience was forbidden to go to him. She was ordered back to work in the gardens. She spent the next 4 hours in a state of shock, her hands moving automatically while her mind splintered into pieces. She could not cry. Crying was forbidden. Showing grief was seen as defiance. She could not rage. Any display of anger would result in her own whipping or worse. She could only continue working, invisible, compliant, broken. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a wagon arrived. Jeremiah Blackwood was a professional slave trader, a man who made his living buying slaves in the Upper South and selling them in the Deep South, where labor demands for cotton and sugar were insatiable. He was a fat man with greasy hair and breath that smelled of whiskey and tobacco. He examined Samuel like a man examining a horse, prying open his mouth to check his teeth, feeling his arms and legs to assess muscle development, completely ignoring the fresh wounds on his back. "He's small," Blackwood said, "and you've damaged him. I can give you $600, not a penny more." "He's 12 years old and intelligent," Whitfield countered. "He'll grow. 800. They settled on $700. Money changed hands. Papers were signed. Just like that, Samuel belonged to someone else. Patience was allowed exactly 2 minutes to say goodbye. Samuel could barely stand, his back still bleeding through the rough shirt someone had put on him. Chains had been fastened around his ankles, connected to chains on 8 other slaves Blackwood had purchased from neighboring plantations. They would walk to Natchez, be loaded on a steamboat and shipped downriver to New Orleans, then sold at auction to sugar plantation owners in Louisiana. 2 minutes, 120 seconds to say goodbye to her son forever. She held his face in her hands. She wanted to say so many things. She wanted to tell him she loved him more than life itself. She wanted to tell him to be strong, to survive, to never forget who he was. She wanted to tell him about his grandmother, the Queen, about their heritage, about the stories and the songs and all the knowledge she had tried to pass to him. But the words stuck in her throat, and all she could manage was, "Remember, remember everything. You are royal blood. You are not what they say you are." Samuel nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Mama," he whispered. It was the last word she would ever hear him speak. Then Blackwood yanked on the chain, and Samuel stumbled forward. The coffle began moving. 9 enslaved people shackled together, walking south toward Natchez and the river, and an unknown fate that would almost certainly mean death in the sugar fields within a few years. Patience stood in the yard and watched until they disappeared from sight. She stood there as the sun moved across the sky. She stood there as other slaves returned to work. She stood there as evening approached and the February cold deepened. She was still standing there when Mistress Constance came out and said, in a voice like ice, "Get back to work, Patience. Your boy is gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. Count yourself lucky I don't sell you too, just to teach you a lesson about forgetting your place." Something broke inside Patience in that moment. It was not a sudden snap, but rather a slow, inevitable fracture, like a tree that has been slowly dying and finally falls. The part of her that had endured, that had survived, that had hoped, that part died. What remained was something else entirely, something cold and patient and utterly focused. She returned to her cabin. Rose and Dinah tried to offer comfort, but Patience barely heard them. She lay on her pallet that night, staring at the ceiling, and felt the transformation taking hold. She had spent 31 years surviving, 31 years enduring, 31 years hoping for freedom someday. No more. In the darkest hour before dawn, Patience rose and walked silently through the quarters to the edge of the woods where Aunt Chloe was buried. She knelt at the grave and spoke aloud to the spirits. In Yoruba and English mixed together, words her mother had taught her for invoking the ancestors. "I call on you, Grandmother Queen," she whispered. "I call on you, Mother stolen and lost. I call on all who came before, all who suffered, all who died in chains. I need your strength now. I need your wisdom. I need your rage. The time has come." She felt something shift in the air around her, a presence both terrible and comforting. The spirits heard. The spirits answered. She reached into the red flannel mojo bag around her neck and removed 3 items: a small bone from Aunt Chloe's finger, taken at burial, a piece of paper with names written on it, and a strand of hair from Samuel's head, saved from his first haircut years ago. She buried these items at the base of Aunt Chloe's grave marker, covered them with graveyard dirt, and made her promise. Master Cornelius Whitfield, Mistress Constance Whitfield, Overseer Marcus Sutton, Jupiter and Caesar, who betray their own people, and any who stand with them. I swear by the spirits of my ancestors, by the blood of my stolen son, by the 31 years of suffering I have endured, they will pay. Every one of them. They will know pain. They will know fear. They will know death. And I will be free, or I will be dead, but I will never be a slave again. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying her words away into the night. And somewhere in the darkness, something answered. Perhaps it was only her imagination. Perhaps it was the spirits. Perhaps it was simply the sound of her own heart, finally choosing vengeance over survival. She returned to her cabin as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Rose and Dinah were still asleep. Patience lay down on her pallet, and for the first time since Samuel had been taken, she slept. And in her sleep, she dreamed of bees. Over the following weeks, Patience began to watch. Not in the way slaves always watched white people, with wariness and careful reading of moods to anticipate danger. This was different. This was the watching of a hunter studying prey. She observed Master Whitfield's daily routine with obsessive attention. He rose at 7 o'clock every morning. He took breakfast at 7:30, eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits, coffee with cream, and 3 spoons of sugar. He spent mornings in his office, managing plantation accounts, writing letters, meeting with overseers and merchants. He took lunch at 1 o'clock, usually cold meat, bread, cheese, fruit from the orchards. Afternoons he spent riding around the plantation on his horse, inspecting the cotton fields, checking on operations, ensuring maximum productivity. He took dinner at 7 o'clock in the evening, the largest meal of the day, multiple courses, wine or bourbon. He spent evenings in his library, reading or entertaining guests from neighboring plantations. He retired to bed at 11 o'clock. Every day, the same pattern with only minor variations. Humans were creatures of habit, and wealthy white men were the most habitual of all, because their power and privilege made them feel invulnerable. She watched Mistress Constance with equal attention. Constance rose at 8 o'clock, took breakfast in her private sitting room at 8:30, spent mornings overseeing the house slaves and planning meals, took lunch at 1 o'clock, spent afternoons on needlework or writing letters or receiving visits from other plantation mistresses, took dinner with her husband at 7, spent evenings playing piano or reading religious texts, retired at 10:30. She watched Overseer Sutton. He rose at 5:30, earlier than the slaves, and was always present when the work bell rang at 6. He spent entire days in the fields, riding between work gangs, watching for any slowness or defiance, quick with his whip. He took his meals at a separate table in the kitchen house, served by an older enslaved woman named Martha. He lived in a small house between the big house and the quarters, strategically positioned to monitor movement in both directions. He drank heavily most evenings, spending hours on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, often firing his pistol at random targets: trees, fence posts, sometimes animals. She watched Jupiter and Caesar, the two drivers. They rose with the other slaves but immediately positioned themselves as enforcers, herding people to work, reporting any perceived laziness, inflicting casual violence to demonstrate their authority. They received slightly better food, were exempt from the hardest labor, and slept in their own cabin rather than sharing with multiple families. They had betrayed their own people for these small privileges, and they were despised for it. Patience memorized every detail, every pattern, every weakness. She noted that Master Whitfield was often alone in his office for hours at a time, that Mistress Constance dismissed the house slaves from her sitting room when she took her afternoon tea, wanting privacy, that Sutton's heavy drinking made him slower and less alert in the evenings, that Jupiter and Caesar often split up, each supervising different work gangs, that the Whitfields entertained guests every Saturday evening, following the same social rituals with predictable precision. But observation was only the first step. She needed a method. And that method came to her one afternoon in early March, as she stood before her beehives, watching thousands of bees moving in their complex patterns, each one part of a greater intelligence, each one willing to die to protect the colony. Patience had been tending these hives for 23 years. She knew each colony intimately, which were more aggressive, which were calmer, which were most productive, which were expanding rapidly and would need new space soon. The bees trusted her. When she opened a hive to inspect the frames or harvest honey, she rarely needed the protective smoke that other beekeepers relied on. She moved slowly and deliberately, and the bees accepted her presence as part of their world. But she knew something else about bees that no one else at Magnolia Grove knew. Something her mother had taught her, knowledge passed down through generations of African beekeepers. Bees could be made to attack on command. With the right preparation, the right manipulation of their instincts, the right triggering of their defensive responses, a swarm of angry bees became a weapon more deadly than any gun. A single bee sting was painful but rarely fatal. But when an entire hive attacked, 40,000 bees, each capable of stinging, each releasing pheromones that signaled other bees to attack the same target, the result was catastrophic. Hundreds of stings could send a person into shock. Thousands could kill. And Patience had 5 hives, approximately 200,000 bees under her care. She began her preparations carefully, making no sudden changes that would alert suspicion. She moved the hives one by one over several weeks from their original location near the orchards to a new position closer to the big house. She told Master Whitfield it was because the bees would have better access to the magnolia trees and garden flowers from this location, resulting in superior honey. Whitfield, who fancied himself an expert in agricultural efficiency, agreed readily. By late April, all 5 hives sat in the garden behind the big house, positioned within 30 feet of the main structure. 3 hives faced the back entrance. 2 faced the side windows of the dining room. Next, she began the process of agitating the colonies. This had to be done subtly, over time, gradually increasing their defensive aggression without causing them to swarm away entirely. She did this through small disturbances, gently shaking the hives in the evening, introducing unfamiliar scents, reducing their entrance size slightly to make them feel more vulnerable to attack. She was careful never to go too far, never to push them past the point of no return. She needed them angry, but she needed them to stay. She also began collecting specific plants and roots for her work. Oleander grew abundantly around the plantation. Its white and pink flowers were considered decorative, but every part of the plant was deadly poisonous. She collected the leaves, careful to wash her hands thoroughly afterward. She harvested Jimson weed from along the creek banks, recognizing its distinctive trumpet-shaped flowers. She found foxglove growing wild in a shaded area near the woods. She gathered water hemlock from marshy ground near the river. Each of these she dried carefully, ground into powder using stones from the creek, and stored in small cloth bags hidden beneath the floorboards in her cabin. Rose and Dinah knew better than to ask what she was doing. They had seen the change in Patience since Samuel was taken, and they recognized the signs of someone working hoodoo. They said nothing and looked the other way. In early May, Patience learned that Master Whitfield was planning a major celebration for August. He had arranged to purchase 20 enslaved people from a Virginia plantation owner looking to sell. The purchase would increase Magnolia Grove's workforce to 167 slaves and would be financed partially through a loan secured by the plantation's increased cotton output. Whitfield was boasting to other planters that this acquisition would make him one of the largest slave owners in Wilkinson County. He announced that he would host a dinner party on August 17th to celebrate the successful purchase. He invited 3 neighboring planters and their wives, men who owned plantations of similar size and wealth. It would be an elaborate affair, showcasing Whitfield's prosperity and cementing his status among the Mississippi planter elite. When Patience heard this news, something clicked into place in her mind. A celebration, multiple targets, everyone gathered in one location. An event that would take place in the evening after dark, when escape would be more difficult. It was perfect. She had 4 months to prepare. She used every day. She studied the layout of the big house with new eyes. The dining room had 4 large windows that could be opened for ventilation in the summer heat. The kitchen house was a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, a common design meant to reduce fire risk and keep cooking heat away from living spaces. The main entrance faced the front drive. The back entrance opened onto the garden, where her beehives now sat. There was a large fireplace in the dining room, used occasionally even in summer when evenings cooled. There were 2 other fireplaces in the main house, one in the library, one in the master bedroom upstairs. Each had a chimney that rose above the roofline, and each chimney connected to flues that provided air circulation throughout the house. She began mapping every entrance and exit. The front door, usually locked at night, the back door which led to the garden, the kitchen entrance, the windows in the dining room, parlor, library, and bedrooms upstairs, the cellar entrance used for food storage. She counted them all, visualized them all, planned how to control them all. She observed which house slaves would be working during the dinner party. Martha would be cooking in the kitchen house. A younger woman named Lily would be serving in the dining room. Jupiter's wife, Chloe, who was also despised for her husband's betrayal, would be assisting. And Patience herself would likely be required to provide fresh honey and fruits from the garden for the meal. This meant she would have legitimate access to the big house during the critical hours. She would be expected to be there. Her presence would not arouse suspicion. In June, she began testing her bees' responsiveness to specific stimuli. She learned that smoke could calm them, but certain scents could enrage them. She discovered that crushing a bee and releasing its alarm pheromones near a hive would trigger an immediate defensive response. She found that loud noises, vibrations, and sudden movements would agitate the colonies. Most importantly, she confirmed what her mother had taught her, that multiple simultaneous disturbances to multiple hives would create a coordinated, overwhelming attack. She also confirmed the kill radius. When bees went into full defensive mode, they would pursue targets up to a quarter mile from the hive, but their most intense aggression was focused within 100 feet of the disturbance. The big house dining room sat exactly 50 feet from the nearest hive. Everyone in that room would be in the kill zone. In July, she began preparing the final elements. She needed a way to release the bees directly into the house, bypassing external barriers. The chimneys were the answer. If she could force the bees down the chimneys, they would emerge through the fireplaces directly into occupied rooms. She designed a system using cloth bags. She would fill the bags with angry bees from each hive, seal them temporarily, carry them to the roof of the big house, and release them down each chimney at precisely the same moment. The bees, disoriented and furious, would follow the airflow down into the house. Once inside, they would attack any source of heat and carbon dioxide, which meant any breathing human being. But getting to the roof required a ladder, and moving a ladder would be noticed. So she prepared differently. She identified that the magnolia tree nearest the house had branches strong enough to support her weight and close enough to the roof that she could climb from tree to roof with minimal noise. She practiced this climb 3 times in the dead of night, ensuring she could do it silently and quickly. She prepared escape routes. If everything went according to plan, she would be on the roof when the attack began. She would descend, move to the back of the property, cross the cotton fields to the woods, follow the creek south to the Mississippi River, swim across under cover of darkness, and follow the river north toward Natchez. From there, she knew of a house that was rumored to be a station on the Underground Railroad, a white Quaker family that helped fugitive slaves reach free territory. Whether this rumor was true, she didn't know, but it was her only chance. She prepared provisions, dried meat, cornmeal, a small knife stolen from the kitchen house, a flint for fire, a blanket. She hid these items in a hollow tree at the edge of the woods, wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. Everything she would need for flight, ready and waiting. She also prepared for the possibility of capture and execution. She made peace with death. She performed rituals at Aunt Chloe's grave, asking the spirits to welcome her if she failed. She asked them to carry her soul back to Africa, back to her homeland, back to her mother. She asked them to watch over Samuel wherever he was and give him strength to survive. She asked them for the courage to complete what she had started. By early August, everything was ready. The bees were more aggressive than they had ever been, barely contained fury in wooden boxes. The plant poisons were prepared. The escape route was clear. The plan was complete. She had rehearsed every movement 1,000 times in her mind. She waited for August 17th. The waiting was both eternal and instantaneous. Days dragged by with excruciating slowness, each one identical to the last, but at the same time the weeks flew past, and suddenly it was August 15th, then August 16th. And then it was the morning of the 17th, and everything was about to change forever. Patience woke that morning with a calmness that surprised her. She had expected to feel afraid, but fear had been burned away by 6 months of planning and 31 years of suffering. What remained was clarity, purpose, absolute focus. She went through her morning routine exactly as always. She ate her cornmeal, she collected her tools, she walked to the gardens and began her work. To any observer, she was the same Patience she had always been, quiet, obedient, industrious. No one suspected that beneath that calm exterior, she was counting down the hours until vengeance. The day was hot and humid, typical for Mississippi in August. The temperature climbed toward 95 degrees by midday. The sky was cloudless, the sun merciless. By afternoon, everyone on the plantation was moving slowly, seeking shade, dreading the field work that continued regardless of heat. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Patience was summoned to the kitchen house. Mistress Constance wanted honey and fresh fruits for the evening's dinner. Patience collected a jar of honey from her stores, along with peaches, figs, and blackberries from the orchards. She brought them to Martha in the kitchen house. Martha was 70 years old, had been enslaved her entire life, and had cooked for the Whitfield family for 35 years. She was preparing an elaborate meal: roasted duck, ham, potatoes, green beans from the garden, biscuits, multiple desserts. The heat from the kitchen fires was brutal, and sweat poured down Martha's face as she worked. Big doings tonight, Martha said quietly as Patience set down the fruits. Master's showing off for all those other rich white folks, acting like he's some kind of king. Patience nodded but said nothing. Martha looked at her for a long moment. You've been different since your boy got sold, Martha said softly. Quieter, but not quiet like scared. Quiet like something else. Like you're waiting for something. Patience met her eyes. We're all waiting for something, Martha. Waiting for freedom, waiting for justice, waiting for the Lord to deliver us. Martha held her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Then the old woman nodded slowly. Amen to that. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Patience left the kitchen house and returned to her cabin. Rose and Dinah were there, preparing their own meager evening meal. They looked at Patience as she entered. You going to do it? Rose said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what you mean, Patience said automatically. Yes, you do, Dinah said quietly, and we know too. We ain't blind. We seen you watching them. We seen you working on something. We know that look in your eyes. Patience stood still, heart pounding. If they knew, if they told anyone, everything would be destroyed. We ain't going to say nothing, Rose said. Whatever you're planning, we ain't gonna stop you, and we ain't gonna tell. They took your boy. They take all our children. They take everything. So you do what you gotta do, and we'll swear we didn't see nothing, didn't hear nothing, didn't know nothing. Patience felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since Samuel was taken. Thank you, she whispered. You do it for all of us. Dinah said. For every child they sold, for every whipping, for every single thing they done to us, you make them pay. As the sun began to set, the guests arrived. Patience watched from the garden as 3 carriages pulled up to the big house. Nathaniel Caldwell and his wife Sarah from Oak Hill Plantation, Montgomery Rutherford and his wife Virginia from Riverside Plantation, Thurston Hampton and his wife Magnolia from Greenwood Plantation, all of them wealthy, all of them slave owners, all of them dressed in their finest clothes for an evening of celebration built on the suffering of enslaved people. Master Whitfield greeted them on the front porch, shaking hands with the men, bowing to the women, ushering them inside with elaborate courtesy. Mistress Constance stood beside him, playing the gracious hostess. Patience could hear their laughter drifting across the lawn, could see them through the windows as they settled into the parlor with glasses of bourbon and wine. At 7 o'clock, dinner was announced. The guests moved to the dining room, taking their seats at the long table. Lily and Chloe began serving the first course. Patience, as planned, was called to bring the honey and fruits to accompany the dessert course. She entered the dining room carrying a silver tray, eyes downcast, the picture of perfect subservience. She placed the items on the sideboard, curtsied slightly, and waited for permission to leave. Excellent honey, as always, Patience, Master Whitfield said, not even looking at her. Your beekeeping skills are quite valuable. You may go. She left the dining room and walked calmly back toward the kitchen house. But instead of going to the kitchen, she slipped around the side of the big house into the shadows of the garden. The sun had fully set now, and darkness was falling. The temperature was dropping slightly, but it was still warm. Warm enough that the dining room windows were open for ventilation. She could hear them talking and laughing. She could hear the clink of silverware on china. She could hear Master Whitfield describing his plans for expanding cotton production. She could hear Mistress Constance discussing the incompetence of house slaves. She could hear the other planters agreeing, sharing their own stories of disciplining their property, congratulating themselves on their superiority and success. Patience moved silently to the storage shed where garden tools were kept. She retrieved the items she had hidden there earlier that day. 5 cloth bags, each about the size of a flour sack, each reinforced with double layers of fabric. She also retrieved a small pot with a lid, inside which she had placed pieces of crushed honeycomb mixed with alarm pheromones from bees she had deliberately crushed that afternoon. She moved to the first beehive. The bees inside were already agitated from the heat and her earlier disturbances. She placed the pot with the pheromone mixture near the entrance, then gently but firmly began smoking the entrance with a small amount of smouldering leaves, not enough to calm them, but enough to confuse them slightly. Then she carefully, quickly, began guiding bees into the first bag, using a small paddle. She had practiced this motion 100 times. Scoop, transfer, seal, scoop, transfer, seal. Within 5 minutes, she had approximately 5,000 angry bees sealed in the first bag, buzzing furiously, desperate to escape and attack. She repeated this process with the second hive, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but she had 5 bags containing approximately 25,000 furious African honeybees. She had been stung 3 times, but she barely felt the pain. Her entire being was focused on what came next. She carried the bags, 3 in one trip and 2 in the second, to the base of the magnolia tree. She looked up at its spreading branches, at the route she had practiced, at the roof of the big house beyond. She took a deep breath. This was the moment of no return. Once she began, there would be no stopping, no going back, no undoing what she was about to do. She thought of Samuel. She thought of her mother. She thought of 31 years in chains. She thought of every whipping she had witnessed, every family torn apart, every child sold, every indignity and horror and endless suffering inflicted by the people who were, at this very moment, eating dinner and laughing and congratulating themselves on their wealth built from human misery. She began to climb. The magnolia tree's bark was rough under her hands. She moved slowly, testing each branch before putting her full weight on it, careful to make no sound. The bags hung from her shoulders on leather straps she had fashioned. The bees inside buzzed angrily, but the sound was muffled enough that it wouldn't carry into the house over the conversation and laughter. She reached the branch that extended toward the house. It was thick and strong. She inched along it, foot by foot, until she was close enough to reach the roof's edge. She transferred her weight carefully, pulling herself up onto the shingled surface. She had done this 3 times before in practice, but never carrying 25,000 angry bees. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. The roof sloped gently. She crawled up to the ridgeline, where all 3 chimneys rose into the night sky. She positioned herself between them, setting down the 5 bags. She could hear the voices from below even more clearly now. She could hear Master Whitfield proposing a toast to King Cotton and Southern prosperity. She could hear glasses clinking. She opened the first bag and held it over the chimney that served the dining room fireplace. The fireplace below was not lit. It was too warm for that, but the flue was open, providing ventilation. She upended the bag and watched as 5,000 bees, suddenly released, confused and furious, poured down into the darkness of the chimney shaft. She repeated this with the second bag, then the third, fourth, fifth. 15,000 bees down the dining room chimney, 5,000 down the library chimney, 5,000 down the master bedroom chimney. Then she reached into her dress and pulled out 3 small cloth parcels. Each contained crushed bee bodies mixed with alarm pheromones, the most powerful trigger for bee aggression. She dropped one down each chimney. The effect was almost instantaneous. From inside the house, she heard the first scream, then another, then multiple voices shouting in confusion and terror. Then the screaming became continuous, overlapping, a chorus of panic and pain. The bees, disoriented by their journey down the chimneys, emerged from the fireplaces into the dining room, library, and bedroom. The alarm pheromones she had dropped told them they were under attack and needed to defend the hive. The heat and carbon dioxide from the breathing humans below identified their targets, and 25,000 African honeybees, each one capable of stinging and then signaling others to attack the same target, descended on the 8 people in the dining room with overwhelming, merciless fury. Patience heard furniture crashing. She heard windows shattering as people tried to escape. She heard Mistress Constance's distinctive shriek cut off abruptly. She heard Master Whitfield roaring, then gasping, then making sounds that were barely human. She heard the guests screaming for help, crying out to God, begging for mercy that would not come. She moved quickly now. She descended from the roof, using the route she had practiced, dropping to the ground with more speed than stealth. She ran to the back of the house, where the main doors were located. Using strips of wood she had prepared earlier, she jammed the back door shut, wedging it so thoroughly that it could not be opened from inside without breaking through. She ran around to the front of the house. The front door was already blocked. One of the guests had apparently tried to escape through it, but had collapsed in the doorway, his body now blocking the exit while bees continued to attack him. She could see him through the window, his face and hands already swollen grotesquely, covered in hundreds of stings. The windows of the dining room had been shattered by people trying to escape, but the bees followed them. 3 figures stumbled out into the garden, screaming, flailing, covered in dark masses of stinging insects. Patience recognized Montgomery Rutherford, his wife Virginia, and Nathaniel Caldwell. They ran blindly, crashed into bushes, fell, rose, ran again. The bees pursued relentlessly. Montgomery Rutherford made it about 50 feet before he collapsed, his face unrecognizable, his throat so swollen he could no longer breathe. He died choking, clawing at his own throat, bees still attacking him even after he stopped moving. His wife Virginia ran toward the slave quarters, perhaps seeking help, perhaps just running blindly. She fell twice, rose each time, her white dress now dark with blood from countless stings. She collapsed a 3rd time near cabin 9 and did not rise again. The bees covered her body completely, a writhing, stinging blanket of vengeance. Nathaniel Caldwell, showing more presence of mind, dove into the decorative pond in the garden, submerging himself completely. But he had to surface to breathe, and when he did, the bees were waiting. They covered his head each time he came up for air. After the 5th or 6th time, he no longer surfaced. Whether he drowned or died from the stings or some combination, Patience could not tell. His body floated face down in the pond, surrounded by dead and drowning bees. Inside the house, the screaming had become less frequent. Patience approached one of the broken windows carefully and looked inside. The scene was beyond anything she had imagined. The dining room looked like a battlefield. The table was overturned. Food and dishes were scattered across the floor, and the bodies, the bodies, lay where they had fallen, each one covered in so many bees that their forms were barely recognizable as human. The air inside was thick with bees, thousands of them still flying in patterns, still searching for targets, still driven by the imperative to defend and attack. Master Cornelius Whitfield lay near the fireplace, his body grotesquely swollen, his expensive clothes torn from his own desperate attempts to remove them, and the bees crawling underneath. His face was a horror, eyes swollen shut, lips the size of plums, throat so enlarged that his head seemed to merge with his shoulders. His hands were still raised, as if trying to ward off attackers. He had died in agony and terror, exactly as Patience had planned. Mistress Constance Whitfield had made it to the hallway, apparently trying to reach the stairs and the bedroom above. She lay at the base of the staircase, one hand stretched upward as if reaching for safety that never came. Her fine silk dress was stained with blood and venom. Her face, the face that had looked upon enslaved people with such contempt, was unrecognizable, features obliterated by hundreds of stings. Thurston Hampton and his wife Magnolia had apparently tried to hide beneath the dining table. It had not saved them. They lay side by side, their bodies touching, united in death as they had been in life, their wealth and privilege unable to protect them from the fury of nature, weaponized by an enslaved woman's rage. Sarah Caldwell, Nathaniel's wife, had died near the sideboard, clutching the honey jar that Patience had brought earlier. The symbolism was not lost on Patience, killed by the very sweetness that had been extracted through violence and oppression. 8 people dead. 8 architects and beneficiaries of slavery, destroyed by the knowledge and rage of someone they had considered property. Patience stood at the window for a long moment, watching the bees gradually calm as their target stopped moving and releasing carbon dioxide. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a deep, cold satisfaction. Justice had been served, not the justice of laws written by slave owners to protect slave owners, but a more ancient fundamental justice, the justice of consequences, the justice of retribution, the justice of the oppressed striking back against their oppressors. She turned away from the window and looked around the plantation. Lights were on in the slave quarters. People were emerging, drawn by the screaming and commotion. She could see figures approaching cautiously, trying to understand what had happened. She needed to move. She had minutes at most before someone discovered the full extent of the massacre and raised the alarm. She ran toward the woods, moving through the garden and past her beehives. Most of the bees had been deployed, but a few remained, and they buzzed sleepily as she passed, recognizing her scent, accepting her. She reached the edge of the cotton fields and looked back one last time. The big house stood silent now, windows broken, darkness visible through the gaps. No more laughter, no more celebrations of prosperity built on suffering, just silence and death and justice. She turned and ran into the darkness of the cotton fields, heading south toward the creek, toward the woods, toward the river, toward freedom or death, but never slavery again. Behind her, the first shouts of alarm began to rise from the quarters as people discovered the bodies. She heard old Moses's voice raised in shock and horror. She heard others calling out, trying to make sense of the scene. She heard someone, she thought it was Rose, shouting that they needed to ring the bell to alert the neighboring plantations to get help. But Patience was already deep in the cotton field, moving between the rows with the familiarity of someone who had worked this land for 23 years. She knew every inch of these fields, every path, every drainage ditch. She reached the creek at the southern boundary of the plantation and began following it downstream, moving quickly through the darkness, using the creek as a guide. She retrieved her hidden supplies from the hollow tree without breaking stride, slinging the bundle over her shoulder. Then she continued south, running when the terrain allowed, walking swiftly when it didn't, always moving, always increasing the distance between herself and Magnolia Grove. She could hear dogs barking in the distance behind her. Someone had thought to release the bloodhounds, but she was ready for that too. She had prepared a mixture of cayenne pepper, black pepper, and crushed pennyroyal that she now scattered behind her as she moved, masking her scent and irritating the dogs' sensitive noses. It wouldn't stop them forever, but it would slow them down, buy her time. By midnight she had covered approximately 8 miles. She reached the Mississippi River at a bend, where the current was slower and the bank was less steep. She stripped off her dress. It would only weigh her down and make her more visible, keeping only her shift. She tied her bundle to her head, took a deep breath, and waded into the dark water. The Mississippi was treacherous even for experienced swimmers. The current was strong, the water cold despite the summer heat, and the river was wide, nearly half a mile across at this point. Patience had learned to swim as a child in the rivers of her homeland, but that was 31 years ago. She prayed her body remembered. She did. She struck out from the shore, swimming diagonally across the current, letting it carry her downstream while she made progress toward the far bank. The water was black and opaque. She could see almost nothing. She focused on breathing, on the rhythm of her strokes, on the distant lights that marked the Louisiana shore. It took nearly 30 minutes to cross. By the time she dragged herself onto the Louisiana bank, her muscles were screaming with exhaustion and her lungs burned. She lay in the mud for several minutes, gasping, shaking with cold and exertion. But she could not rest long. She forced herself to stand, to move inland away from the river, to find cover in the trees and undergrowth. She had crossed from Mississippi to Louisiana, but she was not free. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if she somehow reached a free state, she could be captured and returned. True freedom required either reaching Canada or finding shelter with abolitionists willing to hide her, despite the law. She knew that Natchez, about 20 miles north of where she had crossed the river, was home to several Quaker families rumored to assist fugitive slaves, but reaching Natchez meant traveling back north toward the pursuit she knew was coming. Still, it was her best chance. She spent the rest of the night moving through the Louisiana wilderness, staying away from roads and settlements, navigating by the stars when the trees opened enough to see them. She was hungry, exhausted, terrified, and more alive than she had felt in 31 years. At Magnolia Grove, dawn revealed the full horror of the previous night. When the first neighboring planters arrived in response to the alarm, they found a scene that would be talked about across the South for years to come. The big house was eerily silent. The front door was blocked by a body, the back door was jammed shut, windows were broken, and inside, 8 corpses lay in various positions, each one so extensively stung that they were barely recognizable as human beings. Thousands of dead bees covered the floors, walls, and bodies. A few survivors still crawled sluggishly, their venom spent, their purpose fulfilled. The responding planters stood in the dining room in shock and horror. Jeremiah Blackwood, the slave trader who had purchased Samuel, was among them. He stared at the body of Cornelius Whitfield and shook his head slowly. "I've seen men killed by bees before," he said. "1, maybe 2 at a time. Never like this. This isn't an accident. This is something else." Sheriff Thomas Pemberton from Woodville, Cornelius Whitfield's nephew, was summoned. He examined the scene with growing fury and dawning understanding. "The chimneys," he said, pointing upward. "Look at the concentration of bees near the fireplaces. Someone put them down the chimneys. This was deliberate. This was murder." He turned to face the assembled slaves, who had been herded into the yard under armed guard. "Who tends the bees on this plantation?" he demanded. Silence. Then slowly old Moses spoke. "That'd be Patience, sir. She's the one who managed the hives." "Where is she?" More silence. Then Rose stepped forward. "She was here last night, sir. She brought honey to the house for the dinner. But we ain't seen her since then. We don't know where she went." The sheriff's face turned purple. "Search her cabin. Search everywhere. Find her." They searched. They found the cabin empty. They found evidence of careful preparation, hidden supplies, missing items, signs that Patience had been planning something. They questioned every enslaved person on the plantation, but no one claimed to know anything. The code of silence held firm. The sheriff organized a massive search party. 50 armed white men, 20 bloodhounds, horses, supplies. The largest fugitive slave hunt Wilkinson County had seen in years. They tracked her to the creek, followed her trail south, found the pepper mixture she had used, and cursed her cunning. They reached the Mississippi River by mid-morning and realized she had crossed. The search expanded to Louisiana. Alerts were sent to slave patrols across a 100-mile radius. Wanted posters were printed and distributed. The reward was set at $1,000, an enormous sum, reflecting both Patience's value as property and the whites' desperate desire to capture her and make an example of her. Wanted: runaway slave named Patience. Negro woman, age 38, approximately 5 feet 4 inches, thin build, marks from old whipping scars on back. Extremely dangerous. Responsible for the murder of 8 white persons at Magnolia Grove Plantation, Wilkinson County, Mississippi. Reward of $100 for capture, dead or alive. She's believed to have knowledge of poisons and other dangerous practices. Approach with caution. But Patience was already miles away, moving through the Louisiana wilderness with the instincts of someone who had survived 31 years of slavery and was not about to be recaptured now. For 3 weeks, she evaded capture. She moved mostly at night, hiding during the day. She avoided all roads and settlements. She foraged for food, nuts, berries, roots she recognized from her knowledge of plants. She caught fish from streams using a method her mother had taught her, building small traps from sticks and vines. She drank from creeks and springs. She slept in hollow logs, in dense thickets, anywhere that offered concealment. She suffered greatly during those 3 weeks. Hunger was constant. She lost weight rapidly, her body consuming itself for energy. Injuries accumulated, cuts from thorns and branches, bruises from falls, blisters from endless walking. She was bitten by insects and leeches. She nearly stepped on a copperhead snake and only avoided it at the last second. She developed a fever from drinking contaminated water and spent 2 days delirious, hidden in a cave, certain she would die. But she survived. And slowly, painfully, she made her way north. On the 23rd day after the massacre, she reached the outskirts of Natchez. She knew she could not simply walk into town. A lone black woman without papers would be immediately captured. But she had heard of a Quaker family named Morrison who lived on a farm 3 miles east of Natchez, and it was said they were sympathetic to fugitive slaves. She watched the Morrison farm for 2 days before approaching. She saw a white man and woman, middle-aged, working their land with no apparent slaves. She saw them feeding chickens, tending a garden, living simply. She saw the man reading from a Bible in the evening. These were signs that gave her hope. On the 3rd night, she approached the house after dark and knocked softly on the door. The man, Thomas Morrison, opened it with a lantern in hand. He looked at Patience, filthy, emaciated, dressed in rags, clearly a fugitive, and his face showed no surprise. "Come in quickly," he said in a low voice. "Thee are not safe here in the open." Patience stumbled inside. The woman, Elizabeth Morrison, immediately brought water and food. They did not ask questions. They simply helped. "We know who thee are," Thomas Morrison said quietly. "The entire region is talking of nothing else. 8 dead at Magnolia Grove. A slave woman who turned bees into weapons. The largest manhunt in memory." The Patience looked at them with exhausted eyes. "Are you going to turn me in?" "No," Elizabeth Morrison said firmly. "We are friends, Quakers, and we believe slavery is a sin against God. We have helped 17 fugitives reach freedom in the past 4 years. Thee will be the 18th. Patience felt tears streaming down her face, the first tears she had allowed since that terrible moment of decision at Aunt Chloe's grave. "They took my son," she whispered. "They sold him. They took my child. I couldn't let them live after that." Thomas Morrison nodded slowly. "We do not condone violence, but we understand thee has suffered beyond what any human should endure. And we will not judge thee. God will judge us all in the end. For now thee needs safety." They hid her in a concealed room beneath their house, a space specifically designed for fugitive slaves, accessible only through a trap door hidden under a rug in the kitchen. They brought her food, water, clean clothes. They tended to her wounds and illnesses, and they made arrangements to move her north along the Underground Railroad. But fate had other plans. On September 12th, 1856, 3 weeks after Patience arrived at the Morrison farm, a professional slave catcher named Silas Crow knocked on their door. He had been hired by Sheriff Pemberton specifically to find Patience, and he was good at his job. He had tracked her through a combination of careful questioning, following every reported sighting, investigating every rumor, and he had heard whispers about the Morrison family's abolitionist sympathies. Thomas Morrison answered the door. "How may I help thee?" he asked calmly. "I'm looking for a runaway slave," Crow said. "Woman named Patience. Wanted for murder. I have reason to believe she might have passed through this area. You seen any strange Negroes around here?" "No," Thomas Morrison said truthfully. He had not seen any strange enslaved people. He had helped one. Crow studied his face. "Mind if I look around?" "Yes, I mind," Morrison said. "This is private property. Thee has no warrant. Please leave." That refusal was enough to confirm Crow's suspicions. He left, but he didn't go far. He positioned himself on a hill overlooking the farm and watched for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he saw Elizabeth Morrison carrying a tray of food that seemed too much for just 2 people. He saw her disappear into the house and not come out for 15 minutes. That night, Crow returned with Sheriff Pemberton and a group of armed men. They surrounded the house, then broke down the door before the Morrisons could open it. They searched systematically, looking for hidden spaces, and they found the trapdoor under the kitchen rug. Patience heard them coming. She knew in that moment that her flight was over. She had a knife, the small one she had stolen from Magnolia Grove's kitchen house months ago. She could use it on herself, deny them the satisfaction of capture and execution. But something in her refused. She had not survived 31 years of slavery, had not avenged her son, had not evaded capture for a month, only to kill herself in a cellar in Natchez. When they pulled open the trapdoor, she was standing upright, knife in hand, meeting their eyes without fear. "My name is Patience," she said clearly. "I am the daughter of a Yoruba queen. I killed 8 slave owners at Magnolia Grove Plantation, and I would do it again." They dragged her out of the cellar and shackled her immediately, heavy iron manacles on her wrists and ankles, connected by chains. Thomas and Elizabeth Morrison were arrested as well. Charged with harboring a fugitive slave, they would later be convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Patience was transported back to Wilkinson County in a cage on a wagon, displayed like an animal. Word spread quickly, and crowds gathered in every town they passed through. Some came to jeer and threaten. Others, enslaved people who came to see, who stood silent and watched as she passed, looked at her with something else in their eyes. Something that looked like admiration, pride, hope. She was held in the Woodville jail for 2 weeks while a trial was arranged. The trial itself was a formality, lasting less than 3 hours. She was not allowed to testify in her own defense. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in Mississippi courts. The evidence was presented: the dead bodies, the open chimneys, testimony from those who had seen her bring honey to the house that evening, testimony about her beekeeping skills, testimony about her son being sold. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty of 8 counts of murder. The sentence was equally certain: death by hanging, to be carried out in public as a warning to other slaves of the consequences of resistance. The date was set for October 3rd, 1856. Patience had 2 weeks to live. During those 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. An abolitionist from Boston, a journalist named William Garrison, no relation to the famous William Lloyd Garrison, but inspired by him, came to Mississippi to interview Patience. He had read about the case in newspapers and saw it as an opportunity to expose the horrors of slavery to northern audiences. The authorities, confident in their righteousness, allowed the interview. They believed Patience would be depicted as a monster, proving that slaves were dangerous and needed strict control. But William Garrison was a skilled interviewer, and Patience told him everything. She told him about being captured as a child in Africa, about the Middle Passage, about 31 years of slavery, about her children who had been sold or died, about Samuel and the broken vase and the 25 lashes and the sail to Louisiana, about the knowledge passed down from her mother, about the 6 months of planning, about the night of August 17th and what she had done. Garrison wrote it all down, and he wrote it honestly, and he sent his article to abolitionist newspapers across the North. The Story of Patience. 31 Years in Chains was published in The Liberator, The North Star, and a dozen other papers. It was reprinted in pamphlets and distributed widely. The article caused a sensation. For many Northerners, it was the first time they truly confronted the reality of slavery, not as an abstract political issue, but as a visceral human horror. The image of a mother watching her 12-year-old son whipped and sold, then using ancestral knowledge to exact terrible vengeance, captured imaginations and consciences across the North. Abolitionist sentiment surged. Donations to anti-slavery organizations increased dramatically. The case of Patience became a rallying cry. Remember Patience and Justice for Patience appeared on protest signs and in speeches. In the South, the reaction was fury and fear. The fact that an enslaved woman had single-handedly killed 8 white people, including prominent plantation owners, terrified the slave-owning class. New laws were passed across the South, restricting the already limited freedoms of enslaved people further. Gatherings were prohibited. Teaching slaves to read became punishable by death. Slave patrols were increased. Security measures on plantations were enhanced. Food tasters, locked doors, increased surveillance. But underneath the repression, there was fear. Because if one enslaved woman could do this, what might happen if others followed her example? On the morning of October 3rd, 1856, Patience was brought from her cell to the town square in Woodville, where a gallows had been erected. By law, executions of slaves had to be public, both as punishment and as deterrent. Thousands of people had gathered. White people came to see justice served, to see a murderer punished, to reassure themselves that the natural order had been restored. But enslaved people also came, forced to attend by their masters who wanted them to see the consequences of resistance. They stood in designated areas, under guard, forced to watch one of their own be killed as a lesson. Patience was led up the steps to the gallows. She wore a simple white dress, provided by the jailer's wife, who had been moved by her story despite herself. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her feet were shackled. A preacher offered to pray with her, but she declined. "I've made my peace with God and my ancestors," she said. "I need no intermediary." The sheriff read the charges and the sentence. Then he offered her a chance to make a final statement. It was customary, a way to ensure she took responsibility and warned others against following her path. Patience looked out at the assembled crowd. She saw white faces filled with satisfaction and hatred. She saw black faces filled with grief and something else, something defiant and inspired. She saw children of both races learning lessons from this moment that would shape their futures. She spoke clearly and loudly, her voice carrying across the square. "My name is Patience. Before that I was Abeni, daughter of Queen Ifeoma of the Yoruba people. I was stolen from my homeland when I was 7 years old. I survived the Middle Passage. I survived 31 years of slavery. I bore 5 children, and white people took 4 of them from me. The 5th, my son Samuel, was sold for breaking a vase. He was 12 years old and worth $700 to Master Whitfield. I was told I had no rights as a mother, no rights as a human being, no rights at all. I used the knowledge of my ancestors to kill 8 people at Magnolia Grove Plantation. I do not apologize. They were not innocent. They built their wealth on our suffering. They raped our women. They beat our men. They sold our children. They called it their right, their property, their way of life. I called it what it was, evil. You say I am a murderer. I say I am a mother who defended her child the only way I could, through vengeance. You say I am a criminal. I say I am a human being who demanded justice when your laws provided none. You say this execution will be a lesson to others. Perhaps it will. Perhaps slaves watching this will learn to submit and obey, or perhaps they will learn what I learned, that death with dignity is better than life in chains, and that one person with courage can shake the foundations of injustice. I am not afraid to die. I made my choice 6 months ago at the grave of a wise woman who told me the spirits would guide me. They have. My son is somewhere in Louisiana, and I pray he survives and remembers his mother. I go now to join my ancestors, to return to the homeland I was stolen from. And I say to every enslaved person here, remember your worth, remember your humanity, remember that the chains are on your body, but they can never bind your soul unless you allow them to. Master Cornelius Whitfield died screaming, covered in bees, knowing in his final moments that the property he had mistreated for 23 years had destroyed him. That knowledge is worth more than another lifetime of slavery. I die free in my spirit, and that is a victory they cannot take from me. The sheriff, enraged by her speech, moved to silence her, but Patience had said what she needed to say. The noose was placed around her neck. A hood was offered, but she refused it. I want to see the sky, she said. I want to see the sun. I want my last sight to be of the world I lived in and fought in, not of darkness. The trapdoor opened. Patience fell. Her neck broke instantly, a quick death, more merciful than many slaves received. Her body swayed in the October breeze. In the crowd, a woman began to sing softly, a spiritual that Patience had loved. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? Others joined in, enslaved voices rising in defiance of the guards who tried to silence them. The song spread through the black sections of the crowd, a wave of sound that proclaimed that Patience's spirit would not be silenced by death. The authorities cut down her body after an hour and buried it in an unmarked grave in the colored section of the Woodville Cemetery. They thought that would be the end of the story. They were wrong. Patience's story spread like wildfire through the slave communities of the South. The Underground Railroad's secret networks carried the tale from plantation to plantation. The spirituals gained new verses that encoded her story. The woman who called the bees became a legend, whispered in quarters after dark, passed from mother to daughter, a reminder that resistance was possible. Within a year of her execution, 3 similar incidents occurred in Louisiana, Alabama, and South Carolina, enslaved people using their knowledge of plants, animals, and poison to kill their oppressors. The authorities tried to suppress news of these events, but the stories spread anyway. Patience had shown a path, and others followed. The case of Patience was cited repeatedly by abolitionists in the North as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty and injustice. Frederick Douglass mentioned her in a speech in Boston. When a mother cannot protect her child without resorting to such desperate measures, the institution that created this situation is condemned by every moral law of God and man. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had published Uncle Tom's Cabin 4 years earlier, wrote a short story inspired by Patience called The Beekeeper's Vengeance, which was published in the Atlantic Monthly and reached hundreds of thousands of readers. In the South, plantation owners lived in increased fear and paranoia. They slept with loaded pistols. They had their food tasted before eating. They watched their slaves with heightened suspicion. Some became more cruel, trying to instill greater fear. Others, quietly, began treating their enslaved people slightly better, aware that the alternative might be death at the hands of someone they had underestimated. Magnolia Grove Plantation never recovered. Cornelius Whitfield had no heirs. The property was sold at auction to cover debts. The new owner, a speculator from New Orleans, found it impossible to keep slaves there. They feared the place, believed it was cursed, that Patience's spirit still walked the grounds. The plantation changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War, never profitable again, ultimately abandoned. Today, nothing remains but overgrown foundations and a historical marker that makes no mention of Patience or the events of August 17th, 1856. The 5 beehives Patience had tended were destroyed immediately after the massacre. the bees killed with fire and smoke. But some escaped, and their descendants still live in the Mississippi woods. Local beekeepers sometimes speak of a particularly aggressive strain of bees found in Wilkinson County, bees that defend their hives with unusual ferocity. They call them Patience's bees, though many don't know the origin of the name. In 1861, 5 years after Patience's execution, the Civil War began. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. 4 million enslaved people were freed. The journey to true freedom and equality continues to this day. More than 160 years later, the legacy of slavery persists in systemic racism, economic inequality, mass incarceration, and countless other ways. The fight that Patience fought with bees continues in courtrooms, voting booths, streets, and hearts. But her story endures as a testament to several profound truths: that human beings will resist oppression no matter the cost, that knowledge and intelligence can overcome physical power, that a mother's love is stronger than fear of death, that one person with courage can inspire thousands, and that justice, however delayed and imperfect, will eventually come. Patience was 38 years old when she died. She had been enslaved for 31 years, from age 7 until her death. She spent 6 months planning her vengeance. She was free, truly free, for 23 days, between the night of the massacre and her capture. 23 days of freedom for 31 years of bondage. By any measure, it was not enough. But she chose those 23 days of freedom over a lifetime of submission. And in that choice, she reclaimed her humanity and her dignity. We remember Patience not because we glorify violence, but because we recognize that she lived in a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, so thoroughly evil, that it drove a mother to acts of desperate vengeance. We remember her because her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and the foundation upon which this nation was built. We remember her because she refused to be invisible, refused to be property, refused to accept the role that society had assigned her. And we remember her because, in the face of absolute injustice, when law offered no protection and society offered no recognition of her humanity, she made a choice. I will not die a slave. I will not live without dignity. I will not accept this as my fate, and whatever the consequences, I will act. That choice, to assert one's own humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it, is worth remembering. Not as a model for behavior, but as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, and as a reminder that systems of oppression always eventually face resistance from those they seek to crush. Patience's story is American history. It is the story of resistance and rebellion that rarely makes it into textbooks. It is the story of enslaved people who fought back, who refused to accept their bondage passively, who risked and lost everything for even a moment of agency and vengeance. These stories make us uncomfortable because they challenge the sanitized narratives we prefer. Narratives where slavery ended through the benevolence of white abolitionists and enlightened politicians, rather than through the resistance and rebellion of enslaved people themselves. But the uncomfortable truth is that American slavery ended because enslaved people resisted it at every opportunity, in ways large and small, through 400,000 people escaping via the Underground Railroad, through rebellions and revolts, through daily acts of sabotage and resistance, and yes, sometimes through violence against those who enslaved them. Patience was part of that larger story of resistance. Her son Samuel, sold to Louisiana at age 12, probably died in the sugar fields before his 18th birthday. The mortality rate for enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations was among the highest in the South, We have no record of his specific fate, but we can assume he faced brutal labor, insufficient food, diseases, and violence that characterized the sugar industry. Whether he ever learned what his mother had done, whether he took pride or horror from that knowledge, we cannot know. But somewhere in the fields of Louisiana, a boy who had been loved fiercely by his mother worked and suffered and probably died young, one more casualty of American slavery. If you have felt rage while reading this story, that is appropriate. If you have felt sorrow, that is appropriate. If you have felt discomfort, that is appropriate. These events happened. They are part of American history, part of the foundation upon which modern America was built. Cotton picked by enslaved people clothed the nation and fed the economy. Wealth generated by enslaved labor built cities, universities, and industries. The consequences and legacies of slavery persist today in ways both obvious and subtle. Patience's story asks us difficult questions. What would you do if you were denied every human right? What would you do if your child was taken from you and sold? What would you do if the law considered you property rather than a person? What would you do if violence was the only language your oppressors understood? We cannot answer these questions from the comfort of our lives, free from the horrors Patience endured. We can only acknowledge that she answered them in her own way, and that her answer, however violent and shocking, arose from circumstances of profound injustice. As we remember Patience, we must also remember the countless other enslaved people whose stories of resistance were never recorded, whose names are lost to history, who fought against their bondage in ways large and small and paid terrible prices for their courage. They are the ancestors of millions of African Americans today, and their struggle for freedom and dignity laid the groundwork for every civil rights advancement that followed. The fight for justice, equality, and human dignity did not end with the abolition of slavery. It continues today in struggles against systemic racism, police brutality, economic inequality, educational disparities, and countless other manifestations of slavery's long shadow. When we tell stories like Patience's, we are not glorifying violence or seeking revenge. We are remembering truth. We are honoring resistance. We are refusing to let history be sanitized and forgotten. Remember Patience, daughter of Queen Ifeoma, mother of Samuel, beekeeper, conjure woman, survivor of 31 years of slavery, orchestrator of one of the most unusual acts of resistance in American history. Remember that she was human, fully, completely human, despite a system that denied her humanity. Remember that she loved her son enough to risk everything. Remember that she used knowledge passed down through generations to strike back against oppression. Remember that she died unbroken, her spirit free even as her body hung from the gallows. And remember that for every Patience whose story survived, there are thousands whose stories were lost, but whose resistance was equally real, equally courageous, equally important to the long struggle for freedom that defines the African American experience, and indeed the American experience itself. The bees have long since died. The plantation has crumbled into ruins. The people who watched her execution have been dust for more than a century. But the story remains, passed down through generations, a reminder that resistance is possible, that the oppressed will fight back, and that justice, however delayed, however imperfect, will eventually come. This is the story of Patience, who turned bees into weapons and wiped out a plantation in Mississippi in 1856. It is a true story of American slavery, American resistance, and American justice. It is uncomfortable and brutal and necessary, and it must be remembered so that we never forget the price of freedom and the cost of oppression, and so that we continue the unfinished work of building a society where no one's humanity is denied, no mother's child is stolen, and no person lives in chains.